even better. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started in 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is McKaylee. I work at Tattered Cover Bookstore. And first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Thank you for shopping locally. Thank you for supporting local independent bookstores. We would not be here the past year or the past 50 years without you because yes, that's right. It is Tattered Cover's 50th anniversary this year, which is an amazing feat for a bookstore. And we owe a large part of that success to you, our community, whether that be our virtual community who's helped us and grown significantly over the past 18 months or so, or our in-person community, which we're slowly but surely getting back to that as well. So thank you all so much from the bottom of our hearts. Before I go any further, I want to let you know that closed captioning is enabled for those who might want it or need it. There's a black bar at the bottom of the screen with a button labeled CC on it. If you click that button, closed captioning is enabled, should you want it or need it. And before I go any further, I want to also say that Tattered Cover is a local independent bookstore located in Denver, Colorado, with 4 locations as of 5 now. I can't keep saying, I've said 4 in my introduction. I have it written down here. I'm like, that's not true. It's 5 now. As we opened up our Stanley Marketplace location, which is our children's only store full of kids books galore at the Stanley Marketplace, for those of you that are local that know that here. And we're very excited to have that store open and our new location in McGregor Square. It's been a busy summer for us and it's still going to keep going. We appreciate that so much. Right now we're gearing up for our all-star baseball game celebrations as that takes place in Denver this year. So keep an eye out for that. You can get all the updates on our website at tatteredcover.com or on social media. Also on our website is our events. My gosh, we have so many. We've already had an incredible amount over June. I think we still have like 14 left to go and just so many wonderful events, even including one later tonight at 6:30 if you want to join us for Darcy Woods' new book called Smoke. It has to do with weed and teenagers, and it's very interesting and wonderfully good. So check that out and other ones as well. But the one that we have tonight, I'm very excited to introduce this author and our guests that we have this evening. We have Alex Bezzerides and Sam Kean, and we're going to be talking to them about Alex's new book, Evolution Goes Wrong. So a little bit about our authors here this evening. Sam Kean is a New York Times bestselling author of 5 books, including The Bastard Brigade, The Dueling Neurosurgeons, and The Disappearing Spoon. He edited The Best American Nature and Science Writing in 2018, and his stories have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times Magazine, and Slate. His work has been featured on NPR's Radiolab, Science Friday, All Things Considered, and Fresh Air. His podcast, The Disappearing Spoon, debuted at #1 on the iTunes chart for science podcasts. His new book, The Ice Pick Surgeon, comes out July 13th. And then Alex Bezzerides is a professor of biology at Lewis and Clark State College in Idaho, where he teaches a wide range of classes from human anatomy to physiology to entomology. He earned a bachelor's degree in biology at Colorado State University and a PhD in neurobiology and behavior from Cornell University. His articles have appeared in journals such as Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Behavioral Ecology and Sociobiology. With a background in anatomy and evolution, Alex approaches the study of human body with curiosity for the historical roots of our anatomical perfections. Man, I should have gotten a science degree. I'm glad my theater degree is helping out here. Inspired by his popular college classes that explore the strange but true origins of our body parts, Evolution Gone Wrong is a colorful and fascinating journey into our collective past. Alex lives in Idaho with his wife and their daughter, but right now is calling us from Mexico. So it's my pleasure to welcome Alex and Sam as we talk about Evolution Gone Wrong, and I'm going to turn it over to the pair of them so we could see them here. Hello, gentlemen. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, what impressive bios the two of you have. I read them several times beforehand, but even as I'm reading them now, it's like, these are two very intelligent men, and I'm very much looking forward to your conversations. I want to let you know, our audience members, let you know that we are doing a Q&A session afterwards. Some of you have already been very active in the chat, so that's where you can ask your questions of Alex and or Sam. And for now, gentlemen, I'm going to let you take it away, and I will see you in a bit for the Q&A.
Thanks, McKaylee.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I appreciate it. And I guess I just kind of wanted to jump right in and start asking Alex some questions. So I have to say this was a fascinating, fabulous book. I really, really enjoyed it front to back. I thought it was clever. I thought it was interesting. And to me, it really changed the way that I looked at the human body. I think I'd heard a few of these pieces individually before about, crooked teeth or the difficulties with childbirth, something like that. But for me, it was really overwhelming to have kind of everything in one place and to just hear thing after thing that has gone wrong with our bodies. So I kind of wanted to ask you that question. Did it really sort of change the way you looked at the human body overall writing this book? Whereas before, I kind of thought of the human body as like a sleek Ferrari running around, but at the end, it was like a jalopy, barely holding it together. So I just wanted to ask if you it changed your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I like that. I like the jalopy bit. It certainly did. For some reason, I kind of go in waves. Like there are weeks when it's all for me about sort of waking up with a little back pain and thinking about how that happened. And lately, the last couple of weeks, I just keep coming back to kids, and it changes the way that I see little kids. Like now when I see a little infant and they can't even keep their head held up and they're all fussy and it just seems like they should still be tucked up inside mom. I didn't know so much about why infants have to come out kind of early compared to other mammals. I feel like our birds are just really premature compared to other mammals. We still gestate for a long time, but our brains just don't get sort of as developed as other mammals do by the time we're born. And so we come out all just totally altricial and useless. And I knew so little about that before that always hits me when I see little kids and staying with little kids. I learned while writing this book that other great apes have a C-shaped spine, and that's the spine that kids are born with. And then it has to develop the curves before they're able to up and toddle and walk around. So now when I see a little kid kind of crawling around and starting to stumble and toddle all over the place, I think about their spine developing and
how it's changing shape a little bit.
How it's changing shape to support their little bodies and their feet too. Like I didn't know that. I mean, it makes so much sense, but I didn't know that kids don't have arches. And so now I look at little kids when they're 4 or 5. So I guess it usually is like 5, 6 years old. So now I'm always looking at like a 6-year-old's feet and kind of seeing how's their arch coming along, or is their arch developing or whatever. So yeah, it's definitely changed how I view the body.
Okay. Do you feel like, things make more sense now? You hear about people, I think you even talked a little bit about in the introduction, your kind of personal connection in that, a sore back, you had some knee issues, some crooked teeth or something like most of us had. So can you talk a little bit about do you think that kind of sparked the idea for the book, or was it kind of always in your head wondering about these things, or?
Yeah, I spend so much time teaching. My job is probably 80% teaching, that most of this was just born out of discussions and things that came up in the classroom. I teach a lot of anatomy and physiology to pre-nursing students. And whenever we do the digestive section in class, I'd show this picture I have a picture in the book of sort of the textbook image of teeth, and they're all perfect and 32 of them just fitting in there, just nice. Yeah. And then I'd talk to the class and be like, all right, so, how many of you had wisdom teeth pulled? And how many of you had braces? And how many of you, if you didn't have those things, actually have straight teeth? And it'd be like, hardly anybody in the whole class. And that was the first kind of question where I thought, well, that seems kind of crazy. Why don't our teeth fit in our mouths? So I started to read about it. And at the time I was reading this book called Fork about kind of the history of cutlery and using knives and whatnot. And I realized there's so much to it beyond just the anatomy. There's all these interesting cultural pieces about the development of fire and the use of pottery and all these really, really wild things that I just wanted to tell. I mean, I wanted to only talk about that in class, but of course, you got to move on and start teaching them about the kidney or whatever. But there just were so many interesting things I was learning that it was kind of born out of those discussions. I went back to the office and started writing some things down.
Okay. And do you remember, was there one moment where you kind of thought that, like, the idea for the book kind of came together? So I think I said a moment ago, I had heard individually about these, but the idea of putting them together, I was even kind of jealous when I got the book. I was like, man, that's such a good idea. I wish I
That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I feel that way all the time when I read a really good book. I'm like, oh, why didn't I think of that? It's just so great there. Yeah. I remember when I learned about so I was reading about the throat. So, as a biologist, you end up dissecting a lot of different mammals. We dissect rats and pigs and cadavers and all these different things. And it always struck me how crazy it is that the esophagus is just sitting there right next to the trachea. I mean, you have to just get in there and separate them to be able to distinguish them. And that leads to all these issues of choking and whatnot. And so I started reading about that. And in the process, I learned all these other things about linguistics and speech, about how the voice box in humans has lowered during our evolution to a point that enables speech but makes us prone to choking. And I thought, man, how do I not know that? Like, that's like the most wild, cool biology. And so I started talking to some other biologists, and for the most part, they also didn't know about it. And I thought, man, I've got to get some of this down on paper. So at that point, I had sort of explored the teeth issue, and I'd written a bit about the eyes, and then I just kind of started to look at the body as a whole and find all these places. And then it was a matter of how to organize it. I didn't want it to be just overly iterative where you could just pull out one chapter and read that. I wanted it to be more of a thread. And so then I had to figure out how to put it into sections and make it sort of all run together.
Yeah. That was one thing I was quite impressed with in the book, was the range of different topics you took on. The teeth, the throat, the back, childbirth, just topic after topic. How many of those topics do you feel like you had a good grasp on going into the book, and how many were you sort of just diving in like, I got to figure this out? It's interesting.
Yeah. The middle section I was pretty comfortable with because it was pretty heavily anatomical. So the middle section is all about the musculoskeletal things. There's a a chapter about back pain and foot pain and knee pain. That I was on pretty good footing there. The early chapters are kind of a blend of anatomy and more cultural things. So that required definitely some digging. Where I was really sort of out of my depth at first until I had to read a lot was the last section of the book on reproduction. The first chapter in that section is all about menstruation and the evolution of menstruation. And that was one. I mean, obviously it's not something I've ever done. So I didn't have any firsthand experience. And it's something that it turns out is quite rare in mammals. And that I wanted to get that point across. And it's physiologically pretty gnarly. It's pretty complicated, and its evolution is really complicated. So figuring out how to explain that was first I had to wrap my head around it, and then figure out how to explain it to what I wanted to be a lay audience. I wanted it to be accessible to non-biologists, to people that are just accountants and business people, and like people that aren't scientists. And that one was a challenge. It was sad. I think I really like that chapter. It's probably my favorite chapter of the book, but that was the hardest.
Okay. Well, it came out quite well. I would not have been able to guess which ones you were confident with going in or not. Right. And what you said there kind of leads into the next question. I wanted to shift a little bit into kind of writing and publishing. This was your first trade book.
Right.
Had you written any other books before this? Was your first?
Nope. First of any kind. Just only articles in journals before this. Right.
Things like that. So can you tell me a little bit about the experience of getting published as a first-time author? I think it's something a lot of people wonder about. So just what was your experience?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I kind of just dove right in when I got interested in the topics, and I just started drafting and started outlining and writing. And I spent about a year doing that. So I wrote 2 or 3 chapters. And my wife, at one point, I kind of wanted to just write the whole book, and I thought that's how it worked. And she said, maybe you should just spend like 10 minutes Googling, like, how do you publish nonfiction? I was like, all right, fine. And so I did. And I came to learn in that 10 minutes that you don't write the whole book just right away in nonfiction. That's something that you do in the fiction world. And in nonfiction, you write a book proposal. And so then I spent a lot more time reading about that and how to do that. I spent the second year of it because I was only writing about a day a week because I'm teaching all the rest of the time. And so I spent the second year working on all the elements of the book proposal, which is effectively a document that explains why you're the right person to write the book, why anybody's going to buy the book, some chapter outlines, a sample chapter or 2, things like that. And I got that to the point where I felt, okay, I think I'm ready to get an agent. That was something else I learned, is you can't just go straight to a publisher. You have to sort of route through an agent. So I know very few people in this world. I had a couple of connections of people that I knew that had written a book. So I reached out to them, and their agents promptly passed on the project. It just wasn't the right thing for them. So I have this whole bookshelf of books in my office. We do this thing at my college, at Lewis Clark State College, where we would do we call it a common read, but amongst all biology classes. So every biology class with the BIOL prefix, every single one, every student would read the same book. All the biologists would get their heads together and we'd pick a book every semester. And so I started looking at those books thinking, okay, maybe I can get a connection through one of these. And one of my favorite ones was The Violinist's Thumb. We did The Violinist's Thumb, your second, your second book, right?
Second book, yep.
Second book. So we read The Violinist's Thumb relatively early in that program. And I was flipping through the back of that, and you had given your agent a shout out and the acknowledgements. So I thought, well, that's at least an agent that seems like he's into really, great science writing. So I wrote him and sent him sort of a little email, a little query, a little query letter, and said, hey, here's what I'm thinking. Is this something you might be interested in? And he wrote me back, and I sent him the proposal, and 4 years later, here we are.
Okay, cool. That's great. So you've been working on about 5 years-ish then?
Yeah, it came out about 6 years to the day. I was about 2 years into the pre-agent stage of things, and then it took about another year of course, I made all kinds of mistakes in the proposal, right? So he and I cleaned it up and made it work. And then I went under contract, and then I continued. I mean, I told him, I said, I can only write on Thursday. I teach every other day. So it's going to take me a while. And they were my publisher was really great about it and let me go at it slowly and patiently. And yeah, so then it took a number of years, but I like that it went slow. It allowed me to really do it right the first time, do it a zillion drafts and check everything a bunch of times. And I feel happy with the pace.
Oh, you definitely should be. And how was the process of writing it? It's obviously quite different from writing an academic paper, but then you were teaching a lot too, which might be a little bit more of the voice you maybe were trying to capture here. But how was the writing for a popular audience?
Yeah, you're right. So I think the voice piece of it was, I just sort of transitioned right from the classroom right down onto the paper. And so that I don't think was that dramatic a shift for me. One of the most difficult parts for me was switching from passive voice to active voice. In scientific papers, you always write in the passive voice. You always say, the experiment was set up this way. The lights were turned on at 4 a.m. and the insects were fed at 3 p.m. It's none of this. We fed the insects. We turned on the light. It's all passive voice. So I wrote a lot of my first draft in passive voice. It's just the way I was writing, and the editors had to sort of gently be like, Alex, we need these 90,000 words switched over to active voice. Okay. So that was one of the biggest sort of rookie mistakes I think that I made, and it was it just cost me time. And now as I write and work on things, it's a mistake I'm only going to make once. Now I'm
right, exactly. Yeah,
I'm getting more comfortable writing an active voice now.
Okay, that's good. Let me see what else I wanted to ask here. Which topic was the most difficult for you to write about? Yeah,
so I think it is the menstruation chapter. So the hardest part about understanding why menstruation evolved is that you very quickly get into this term spontaneous decidualization. And I remember when I was outlining, I just sort of set that term aside, and I was like, okay, I'm going to figure out later what that means, and then I'm going to explain to everyone what that means. Okay. And what that means is that the uterine lining in a human and a few other random mammals, there's like a few bats and like an elephant shrew and a handful of other primates, the uterine lining just changes spontaneously. It changes in preparation for pregnancy instead of in response to pregnancy. In most mammals, the uterine lining doesn't change until the animal gets pregnant. But in humans and a few other mammals, it just changes because of changes in hormone levels. It just changes spontaneously. And once it's changed, if the animal doesn't get pregnant, then it all has to be gotten rid of. And that's menstruation. So I quickly realized while writing that chapter that the question isn't really, why do human females menstruate? The question is, why do they do that? Why do they why did they change that layer spontaneously? And that got me into a whole other slew of biology and behavioral stuff, and then really deep down to evolutionary paths that were really interesting, but also pretty wild, and these very modern hypotheses. Nobody's even really thought about this until the last generation or so. So it's this very, very new science. And unraveling that whole rat's nest and figuring out how to get it down on paper, it was a lot of fun, but also very difficult.
Yeah. How did you deal with that when it's a topic? Some of my books have run into that where it's a fairly new bit of science and it's a little unsettled yet. How did you end up dealing with that?
Yeah, I think you just have to be really open about it. I would build it into my transitions at the end. I would try and summarize and be like, look, I've presented two hypotheses, which there are effectively two major hypotheses for why that happens in humans. And I presented both those hypotheses and tried to lay them out. And then at the end, I sort of summarized and said, but remember, this is all really new. If you asked this question in 1980, we had zero hypotheses for you. And even, moving into this century, you probably only had the beginnings of one of those hypotheses. I said, it's important if you're interested in this kind of thing, it's why you have to stay tuned, right? I mean, you have to keep your eye on science and on the news, and people are going to figure out more about these topics. And that's especially, I mean, with ones that might relate to your health. I think like with the fertility chapter, which is the one that follows menstruation, that's one where, anybody that's having fertility issues or thinking about having kids, like the science on that is just changing so quickly and so fast that you have to stay on top of it if you want to know what's going on.
Yeah. I thought it worked well because you did give a sense of momentum that, we are learning something, but there's a bit of a sense of excitement too, that there's still things to learn. So
yeah, I stress that to my students all the time, especially when we start talking about things like bacteria or even how the genetic code works. Like we know what the blueprint is now, but we have a very rudimentary understanding of how genes switch on and off and how the regulation works. And I tell them like, that's 21st century biology. And there's so much left to learn.
Yeah. A couple other things I wanted to ask about the book. So in addition to all of the sort of great content in there were a few things you did that I really enjoyed. One of them was you had a little quiz at the start of each chapter, which I liked. Where did you get the idea for that?
I knew I wanted, I've read a bunch of these sort of science books, and I wanted something to lead the chapter. I kind of like the idea of having a little quote or having a little, drawing or something to start off the chapter. And, I write a lot of test questions, obviously. Right. And at some point I was just talking with somebody, and just threw out a little piece of trivia related to one of those questions. It might have been, the number of teeth pulled from a human's mouth, the record, or maybe it might have been the one about, I'm always asking people, like when I figured out that one about the fastest 100 meters ever run on 4 feet, right? Like that's the kind of thing I just like to throw out there at a party and be like, hey, how fast do you think you could run 100 meters on 4 feet, And so I did 2 or 3 of them, and I thought, all right, I'm going to give this a shot and see if the editors will keep it. And they did. They took out some other kind of quirky things, but you only need so many in a book, right?
Okay. What did they take out? I'm curious.
Well, I had for every illustration that made the cut, I had a whole bunch of other ones. I kind of prided myself on writing these kind of Far Side-ish, one panel, kind of really fun cartoon kind of illustrations. And I had my illustrator, Peter Davidson, who I just think the world of. He worked up a couple of them for me. There was one about there was a baby shark that wouldn't eat a hagfish, and the mom was like, "You don't get any dessert unless you finish your hagfish," or whatever, stuff like that. And in the end, they were like, I think there's enough humor in just the writing alone for it to stand alone on those merits. And also, it would have ended up being 420 pages or something had we kept every single one of those illustrations. But I have a whole file of silly illustrations to accompany the book.
Okay, we'll put them online or something. Those sound fun.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, and actually, it kind of leads into my next question, was about the humor. I still remember some of the illustrations in there that were quite funny, like the fish that was awake and asleep, and it was the exact same picture. Yeah. The humble cordite and the less humble cordite. So those worked. And there, as you said, there was humor in the writing of it as well. Was that a conscious strategy to put in humor? Was that just your personality? Was it a bit of gallows humor, and that you were trying to keep things light amid all the sort of misery of the human body?
Yeah, I think it's mostly my personality. It's the way I teach too. If you're looking out over the room and half the class is asleep, you know something's going wrong, and you've got to kind of lighten it up and keep it interesting. And I feel the same way about writing. I mean, there's so many incredible researchers and scientists that I don't think their stuff just doesn't translate often to popular work because it's just a little bit dry. And so I wanted to sort of hit that sweet spot where I could bring some pretty heavy science to the fore, but do it in a way that was fun and entertaining and that you wanted to keep going. So yeah, it was kind of a conscious thing, but I don't think you can sit down and be like, all right, I'm going to make this section really funny. It kind of either is or it isn't.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the book is a real reflection of my personality, I think.
Okay, good. One story, I think the story to me that kind of jumped out that I'll probably remember most from this book is the Monet story, which I just found to be fascinating. So I was wondering if you could summarize that or just tell it.
Yeah, so the story this is in the vision chapter, and Monet was suffering from really terrible cataracts late in life, and he had cataract surgery. This is in like the 20s, I think. He had 1920s. He had one lens just straight up removed. So now when they do cataract surgery, they take out a lens and they put a synthetic lens in its place. But I don't think that was a thing back then. So he just had his one lens removed, left the other one in, and he came out of it able to see out of that one eye UV reflectance. So, which is kind of crazy. So typically human vision is cut off at sort of right around 400 nanometers on the electromagnetic spectrum. It's about 390. Anything below that is into the ultraviolet, and we can't see it. Other animals, there are some other animals that it's shifted down a little bit lower. So there are some birds that can see into the UV. I remember reading, so I knew a little bit about this going in. I remember reading papers about like owls can see. Apparently, this is kind of a crazy little anecdote. I guess mouse urine reflects UV light. Unlucky for the mice.
Yeah, bad for them.
And owls can see that UV reflectance, so they can see the mouse trail and where the mouse has been going. So there are other animals that can see into the UV. So what that story sort of teaches is that, in fact, we are sensitive. The cells in our retina are sensitive to ultraviolet light, but our lens filters it out. And then that brings up this big question. Well, why does that happen? And I get into that a little bit, but so then, you skip forward 30, 40 years, and my grad advisor's dad had cataract surgery in probably the 60s. And by then they were putting in a replacement lens, but the replacement lens didn't filter UV. So the UV was still getting back to the retina, and he came out of the surgery able to see UV reflectance. So that means he's looking at flowers and seeing patterns that other people don't see, like, because a lot of flowers, because bees can see into the UV, a lot of flowers have these UV patterns that are invisible to most humans. And now it's, things have gotten more boring for people that have had cataract surgery. Like my dad's had cataract surgery and he doesn't have super honeybee vision. The lenses that they put in there now also filter the UV out. So I think we're done creating humans that can see into the UV, unfortunately, which is kind of too bad. It's kind of a cool perspective.
A little bit, yeah. Late in life, what's the harm,
Right.
Yeah, but I just love that story of Monet possibly being able to see different colors. Considering how famous he was for his colors, him being able to see it, or the idea of just walking out into a garden, maybe the flowers you'd seen all your life, and suddenly they're totally different. So
no, it's got to be wild, right?
Yeah, that was really that anecdote really stuck with me. So I like that story. So you mentioned, or I think you mentioned in the book, you have a daughter, correct?
Right. Yeah, she's 8 years old.
8 years old. Okay. Yep. Did writing this book change how you raised your child at all? You mentioned at the beginning, how you look at them a little bit. Did it change how you?
Yeah. So, she'd been about 2 when I started, and those early chapters in the book, which are all about issues of the head and neck, a lot of those have relevance to raising a child. So the first one, I learned a lot about sort of, as opposed to the nature aspect of why our teeth don't fit in our mouths, there's a whole nurture aspect of why our teeth don't fit in our mouths, which effectively drives to the fact that we just only feed them mushy foods. Right. And if you only feed a kid mushy foods, or if you only feed an animal mushy foods, there's some great research by Daniel Lieberman at Harvard that's done these studies. the jaw just doesn't develop to the same size and strength that it does if you make that animal chew all the time. So, certainly as I was raising my daughter, I'm trying to sneak more, raw vegetables in there and things to make her work her jaw. The vision chapter, I learned how important it is to get your kids kicked outside and get them into natural light for the eye to develop to the appropriate length. They're less likely to end up myopic the more you can get them to spend time outside. So it's any excuse to kick kids out, out the door and make them play outside is a good one. And certainly the choking, the throat chapter had a big influence on me and how we raise her, because you read all these horrific stories and things about kids choking, and I didn't, it's just incredibly common that kids choke on small pieces of food and on non-food objects. And so, I was mutilating every single grape and hot dog to an incredible, until very recent. Like, she's only recently graduated to the point where I will let her eat a grape without me cutting it in half.
Comfortable. Okay. How did the slipping vegetables into the food go? Did she tolerate that or not so much?
Yeah, veggies, as long as as long as it's something that's got enough sugar in there, like a pea or a carrot or something, I could get away with it. The one that I struggle with is meat. She only really wants to eat meat if I've cooked it practically to the point where her jaw still doesn't have to do much work. Like slow cooked all day long, really tender. Okay. So I won't be that shocked at all if braces are in her future. My teeth became pretty crooked late in life, and I think it's a lottery whether or not she's going to end up in braces, but we'll see.
Yeah, I had braces too. So, and the one thing you to go back to this a little bit, what you said about the getting them outside, that was another little moment that stuck out with me in the book. Is that even if they're on a screen outdoors, It's not, I think we have a tendency nowadays to blame the screen as opposed to the being inside. Whereas you said it's actually being outside that's the important part, even if they're near a screen.
That's right. I think there's always kind of a scapegoat for vision in every generation. And then in my generation, it was, hunched over a book for too long and squinting at something for time on, for this generation, it's too much screen time. And of course, I'd love to find any excuse to blame screens, but some of the more modern research suggests that really you just need to, this sort of wimpy artificial light that's inside just doesn't really do the trick for getting an eye to develop to the right length. You need to get outside, and I mean the rates of myopia are just mind-boggling in parts of the world now, and I think that's a big part of the explanation behind it.
Okay. Well, I had one more question, and I think we can probably open it up to the audience at that point, if we'd like. And this last question was, are we eventually going to get over some of these problems about, backs and jaws and things, where we've had a lot of changes in our species over the past few million years, and especially the past, few 100,000 years. But are we just kind of stuck with these things? Will we eventually get over them, or are we kind of doomed?
Yeah, this is why you have to be kind of funny about it, because I think I don't think our physicality is playing that big of a role anymore in our natural selection. Like a bum knee or a foot that gives you trouble, for the most part, there are places in the world, but for the most part, those things are not keeping us from finding a mate and from survive. Certainly, they're not hindering survival for the most part anymore, and not keeping us from finding a mate. So yeah, I think there's two sides of the coin, right? The sort of the pessimistic glass is half empty side is that, I think we're kind of stuck with these things. We're going to continue to have back pain. I don't think orthodontists are going out of business anytime soon.
Because we've lifted the constraints, the harsh constraints on natural
selection.
Exactly.
Now, I mean, if you want to roll, 100,000 years down the line, and it's a post-apocalyptic world, and we're all hunting and foraging again, then sure, then some of these things might get ironed out. But the flip side of that coin is that we're getting pretty darn good at slapping Band-Aids on these problems. I mean, you think about the way that we did the Band-Aids 100 years ago compared to what we're doing now, and I think it's almost impossible to even imagine with the genetic editing revolution that is coming, and with the stem cell therapy and these ways that we're going to be able to treat these problems. I think we're going to be able to smooth a lot of the edges. The problems are still going to be there; they're still going to exist, but I think we're going to be able to help people to a much greater degree that have problematic backs. Or, I mean, you think about just what we can already do with people's vision. My wife was kind of, I tell a story about her in the chapter. She was 2,400 in one eye and legally blind in the other. And she went in, 15 minutes later after LASIK surgery, and she now hasn't worn glasses for 20 years. That's pretty incredible.
That is pretty incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. So. Okay.
End with a bit of optimism. That's good.
Yeah, there you go.
I like that. Always end with a little bit of optimism. That's awesome. I am so excited to hear more about not just this book, but what our audience thinks and what they're curious about. So I do want to encourage you, audience members out there active in the chat, to still send in some questions for us that you have here for Alex and Sam, not me. But I think this is a really fun one to kind of start with, of what is next for you, and do you want to attempt at writing another book?
So next for me straight away is to get back to the classroom. This fall, I have an intro bio class for biology majors, which is always really fun to teach. I get to talk about, the class is evolution and ecology. So it's a lot of these kinds of topics, and you just go through all the different kinds of, it's just really a kick in the pants. And then I am also teaching entomology this fall. So we get out in the field and collect insects, and that's just a blast to teach, because every year I teach it, somebody brings something new into the lab that I've never seen before, because they're insects, and so I just learned so much. I want to keep writing if I can. It's, I think it'll probably depend on the success of the first book, but I'd love to explore this same kind of idea, but maybe with some other topics. I'm kicking around allergies and autoimmune disorders. I find as I talk to people about their allergies, that gets them even more excited than talking about their bum knee. Everybody has some, an aunt or a kid that has a food allergy, or, that has some kind of autoimmune disorder. So those, and I think exploring the evolutionary roots of that would be a really fun, fun next idea. So I'm starting to read a lot about dust mites and like the history of milk and eggs and peanuts and all these kinds of things. And man, just like with what I learned in the first book, there's just so many, it's a matter of, you have to figure out it's all interesting to me, and you have to figure out what's the most interesting to put down on paper.
I was surprised recently to hear that people who eat the cicadas came out on the East Coast this year. They're apparently close enough related to shellfish, where people who have shellfish allergies, they try to eat the cicadas as a little joke or something, and they find out the hard way about the biology there. That's
really interesting. I hadn't read that yet. Shellfish are, they're sort of, they talk about the big 8 in terms of food. The big 8 allergens, and shellfish are one of those 8. And so that's really interesting, because they're obviously both arthropods, but what's not an arthropod? But that's interesting. That I'll have to look at the arthropod tree and place cicadas next to the shellfish. Yeah, that's cool. I just found it.
I'm the kind of person who, I got myself an English and theater degree, but my first job out of college was an internship at NASA to do marketing for them, right? So learning about sciences and that, it's always just so interesting to hear people talk about what they're passionate about. Speaking of books, though, and what's next, Sam, can you give us a hint about what the Ice Pick Surgeon is about?
Yeah, so it is basically a collection of stories about scientists who got so obsessed with some topic or idea that they took things way too far, trampling ethical boundaries and often committing crimes in the name of science. So there are stories about piracy, murder, espionage, fraud, kind of all of the criminal arts are represented in different chapters. And it was kind of a chance to examine a little bit of the dark side of science. There's definitely the wonder of scientific discovery there, but also kind of married with the illicit thrill of a true crime tale. And these are kind of the rogues of science history. And some of the chapters are sort of fun chapters about people mostly, trying to sabotage each other, trying to destroy each other. The petty jealousies got the better of them. But there are some fairly serious chapters in there as well about, people's lives being ruined and things like that. And a lot of them, surprisingly to me, were really resonating with people today. You hear kind of the echoes of these stories down through history about things like vaccine hesitancy or, unethical drug trials that have still caused problems in parts of the world. So I was really surprised that these historical tales had as much relevance to a lot of things that we're still seeing today, just in addition to being kind of wild, entertaining stories about scientific criminals on their own.
Scientific criminals. I love it. That's so cool. I like this next question too. Sam has always had such great titles for his books. And Alex, I really like yours as well. Where did you come up with Evolution Gone Wrong?
That's funny. So the title of the book for the first, let's say, 5 years was Mastodon Stew, which is the title of the first chapter of the book. And I tell this story in the first chapter about sort of by the time humans could get to the point where they could make a meal of Mastodon stew, that was kind of the final straw for the teeth, because by that point, you don't really need a very strong jaw. You can just cook the thing down into mush. And so I had found a recipe for elephant something or other in one of my parents' like quirky cookbooks. And I was like, all right, I'm going to write up a recipe for Mastodon stew. And I liked that idea. And so I held on to that title for a long time. And finally the editors called up one day and they said, okay, we need to have a chat. And they said, this is like, we've taken this to our art department and it's just not working for us. And so it was my first book. It was kind of my baby. The title, like I was a little too attached to it. If I'm like, now I can be reflective now and be retrospective. I'm like, I probably hung on a little too hard. I said, all right. So we tried this and that and nothing really worked. So I workshopped it and sent it out to a bunch of good friends that had read pieces for me. And I said, hey, we're looking for ideas here. And it was kind of a struggle, but one of my really good friends, Tom Urquhart, I used to teach anatomy and physiology with him. He was one of my first past science readers because he knows so much about anatomy. And he kicked out that idea. And I thought, I think I can, at the point I thought, okay, I can live with that. And in the year that's come, I've kind of grown to like it instead, and realized that I think it works a lot better than the Mastodon stew ever would have. So,
do you still think of it secretly as Mastodon stew?
The file on my computer is absolutely still labeled Mastodon stew. I view the editor's job now, having been through this one time, as sort of defending the author from themselves. I think that's a big part of their job, and that's a place where they did a really good job in that sense. They did. I really respect the fact that they kept my voice in the book. They didn't make, they tightened the book obviously, and they made it much more marketable. But still my voice coming through, and I love that. They didn't change it to a degree. It's still very recognizable to me.
I had similar experiences where the titles of some of my books were changed after discussion with the editors as well. But yeah, like as you said, it's good when they can keep your voice and kind of keep that part of the book. But the title has to change sometimes. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I'm a fan of Mastodon stew, you heard me laugh. I think that's incredibly endearing. But I get what they're trying to do with it. But this, having an editor that keeps your voice and keeps it true to what it is more than you could absolutely ask for. That's awesome. And
that's so true.
The last question that we have here is actually for both of you. And it's for you, Sam, as a reader of Evolution Gone Wrong, and for Alex, you as the writer. So interpret it as you will, but it's one of our favorite questions to ask here at Tattered Cover. But what did this book, Evolution Gone Wrong, teach you? And I'd love it if we could start with Sam and then end with our author of the hour here, Alex.
Okay. Well, I would, I sort of, to summarize something I said before, that I think I'd heard individually about, the jaw, and that if you chewed mushy or you had too much mushy food when you were a kid, you might end up with crooked teeth, might affect your breathing. I'd heard individually about childbirth and how precarious it was, kind of these individual things, but I'd never put them together into one place. And as I mentioned, sort of the jalopy, like sputtering along, that it's kind of a miracle that we don't all end up, and maybe we will all end up with back pain or knee pain or something like that. So it really changed the view I had of the body, from like this sleek kind of machine that's all put together to something that is precarious, but in part because of that precariousness, we can learn a lot about ourselves and kind of get a better, more comprehensive picture of where we came from. So that was interesting to me, that kind of rethink the body in that way.
That's awesome. And Alex, for you?
For me, it was more the things that I learned were more about the process and how important it is I learned more about science. You learn a ton during graduate school, you learn a ton during the first few years you're doing research, but then it's easy to kind of get in a rut as a professor. And yeah, you make changes to your classes and you make little tweaks here and there, but I didn't feel like I was learning as much as I had through my 20s and 30s. And you have to get out of your comfort zone. You have to just pick up some random new instrument that you don't even know what it is and start to try to learn to play it. And that's what this was for me. I had to learn about how to even go about writing a book and how to go about publishing a book. And then I had to learn all these different pieces of science. I mean, I had to read all these crazy papers about how humans first came up with fire and things like that I'd never even thought about before. And that I loved it. To me, even if it never got beyond the file on the computer, that was worth it to me, because I just learned all these great new things to share with my students and to talk with people about. And that was what sort of the benefit of getting out of your academic comfort zone was the thing that kind of sticks with me, that I really will take away from this. And it's why I want to keep doing it again. Even if I don't ever get to write another book, I'm going to know so much more about allergies and autoimmune disorders 2 or 3 years from now than I do sitting here right now. And I love that.
Were there any chapters you had to cut, or that things you found out after you started writing that would have made it?
Yeah, I started going down a sinuses path, because the evolution of the sinuses is really fascinating, and it's a whole other sort of like, why are they even there to begin with? So that didn't make the cut. I dabbled in the appendix and tonsils for a while, but the appendix has kind of been just beaten like a dead horse. So I felt like that story's been told pretty solidly. So I left that out. Okay. But yeah, there are a handful of other sort of started chapters that are in the Mastodon stew file that never made it to the light of day.
Okay, just curious.
It's always fun to see what is left on the cutting room floor.
Right, exactly.
Always finding out, hey, what's that one fact you couldn't figure out how to include? Absolutely. Right. Alex and Sam, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. I know that I learned a lot, and I know that people are going to thoroughly enjoy this book. Whether you did get a science degree or a theater degree, I promise. It's thoroughly enjoyable, and you should get your copy today at tatteredcover.com. I want to give each of you a chance to remind people who you are, where they can find you online, and anything else that you want to say before we close out tonight. And once again, Sam, I'm going to start with you before we end with the author of Evolution Goes Wrong.
Okay. Well, hi, everyone, again. I'm Sam Kean. My book, The Ice Pick Surgeon, which I mentioned, is out July 13th. I have 5 other books out there, and you can listen to my podcast, which is also called The Disappearing Spoon. But you should definitely get Evolution Gone Wrong as well. So.
And Alex?
Yeah, I want to start by just thanking Tattered Cover. I grew up half an hour away from Tattered Cover in Golden, Colorado. And so the Tattered Cover was, the dream bookstore as a kid. We'd go down there and we would literally, it's only one of 2 bookstores I've ever been to where you can literally get lost, like not just figuratively, like as a kid, you can look around and be thinking that you might have to sleep in the bookstore because you haven't seen your parents for a while. And the only other one is in Portland that I've been that's like that. So it's a real treat to get to talk to Tattered Cover, and I really appreciate that. And thank you so much, Sam, for agreeing to do this, and I've respected your writing for so long, and this in a roundabout way, this never happens without The Violinist's Thumb, because that's the kind of book that got me going down this path of thinking about writing for a broader audience. So it's a real treat to talk to you. If people want to read a little bit more, my website is alexbezzerides.com. My Twitter handle's at Alex Bezzerides. I'm up to 82 followers, so I'm really blowing up, and I'm just kind of getting started in that world. It's not something I've ever really done before until this book, and so I'm navigating. Talk about learning new things. I'm navigating that world as well, but I just really appreciate the chance to get to talk about it.
Absolutely. And that makes my heart happy as another Colorado native growing up with Tattered Cover. That's wonderful to hear. Well, if you ever stop in, we'll be happy to have you sign books, or maybe you can come for a paperback or your allergy book. We can have you in store signing books.
That'd be great.
Too. But for now, you can get your copies of Evolution Gone Wrong, by Alex Bezzerides at tatteredcover.com or at any one of our locations. They are on the shelves. I know because I ordered them and put them on there myself. So they're there on the shelves. You can visit us at tatteredcover.com and get copies there as well. Gentlemen, if you'll stick around while I just close this out here. We're so excited to be celebrating the release of Evolution Gone Wrong by Alex Bezzerides, and you can get your copies at tatteredcover.com. Follow us online, and you can watch all of our past author events that we've had virtually on our YouTube channel, so check those out. We thank you all for joining us tonight. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you for shopping locally, and happy reading. Night all. And we're out.
Sweet. Thanks, McKaylee.